Rock and roll.
For a minute there, I was ready to go dance. It's all right.
I was like, it's not
All
right.
right,
Okay,
welcome.
thank you.
And if you'd like to introduce yourself, we're live streaming and we'll then be interested in hearing your perspective on this bill.
Okay, well, I'm Cher Feidelberg. I grew up in South Burlington. I moved there when I was 14 years old and have continued to live in South Burlington for a good deal of my life. The place I live right now is Stonehenge North, which is a condominium townhouse development just off of Spear Street, which is very interesting because when I was a child, teenager, that's where we used to play back there. You know, you could explore the woods and run along Potash Brook. And now, of course, it's changed. And I am the citizen coming in who is the person who's really worried about HOAs and the town regulating whether or not I can grow food. And so I'm representing the idea that to grow food is a Vermont right. Similarly inspired in some ways by the, what is it called? The right to dry that was enacted in 2009, you know, where at one point it was highly regulated that we couldn't put towels over our balconies to dry the towels as we came off of out of the pool. We couldn't hang lines. It was a very interesting dynamic. So I'm here before you to ask you to really consider supporting the bill that Martin has written up. I am an idealist right through and through my soul. And so I'm really hoping that this conversation will actually inspire what I heard. It was a privilege to come in early and have it run late because I'm a naturalist at heart and I come from an ecosystem base. And so I've been thinking about all of you a lot today about how do you take what I'm asking, which by itself is like the peanut inside the shell, but then it's when you go to take it out, you're going to break apart other systems around it that I don't have any idea how that ripple effect is going to affect other work that you've done or other laws that are on the books. So is that enough of an introduction? And so now, do you want me to talk more in depth about the vision?
Yeah, I think so. Whatever you came prepared to say, we're happy to hear it.
I came prepared to be flexible. And then the rebound isn't helping because my understanding is you don't have the packet that I sent to Martin, which was my initial proposal, which is a drafting idea of if there is a law that supports Vermont citizens' right to grow food, and the way that Vermont is developing its properties and encouraging housing development, how do you then regulate it with good old Vermont common sense? And I believe very strongly that this law can go into effect, the right for every Vermonter to grow food, because we especially have the resources in Vermont to make that happen. We have the UVM Extension Service. We have people who are treasures like Charlie Nardozzi. Everywhere you look, there are people that have worked very deeply in gardening and creating diverse ecosystems and biodiversity in and around developments. And so I am really aware of the connection. I'm going to try to really stay on point. So I'm going to use myself as an example. I live in a lovely townhouse development. And we are regulated by very, very strict high bar laws or proclamation, I don't know what you call them, you know, guidelines for making any changes to our declaration or bylaws. And in fact, in doing research about this, HOAs often set the bar higher for changes than you folks in the legislature and the actual law. So I'm trying to condense stuff. several years ago, my neighbors and I, and we lost the picture on Google Map, began to talk about the capacity for growing food in Stonehenge North and Stonehenge South, which is completely separate. And we sat out on our lawns very casually, but with intent, looking at the property and thinking about whether or not, because we had water spigots right outside our front door, whether we could extend this space from the foundation out towards the main walkway that connects all 4 units for gardens. Or, because of the way Stonehenge is developed, on the other side of that walkway is open land. And through a real collaborative process, we came to the conclusion that extending from the foundation was not desirable because we were looking for true consensus, because families spilled out onto that little piece of land. And this is the way the ecosystem works. It was partially due to the fact that the fire marshals in South Burlington had us all move our grills to the far side of that walkway to protect the townhouses from fires. So what it did was that changed how people use their property. And so we decided together, no, we would not want to do anything from the foundation out immediately, but we would want to put in either small individual plots, or a community plot for the townhouses right there. And that would be enhanced or made more possible by the spigots that were out the front door, and by the fact that we had worked really collaboratively to kind of get to this place. So as the story goes on, we found out that we just really can't do that. We're lucky we have 18 plots in the center of Stonehenge North that are up for grabs each summer for people who want to have bigger gardens. Our vision was that the out the door garden was more of an intensive garden, really aimed at salads, low growing, robust plants that didn't, and here's the spider web in the ecosystem, disturb to an unsightly extent the curbside value. That is what makes everybody freak out in the United States about having a garden in your front yard. If you go to Europe, having a food garden in your front yard or visible from the street from any angle is very acceptable. And they're pretty and they're nice and they've been there for so long, nobody thinks about it. So we're talking about changing a lot of things, including culture. So basically, some of the reasons that I'm passionate about getting something like this passed is that while I think of it as a privilege to have those 18 plots in the center, they don't address some very significant issues. Who lives in a townhouse today continues to unfold as our culture and as our economy changes. The folks that can use the plots in the center of the property are much more physically able residents. Anybody that has any kind of mobility or balancing issues or any strength issues are less likely and unlikely to use the plots, because the plots are in the center, the water source is here. It's quite a generous piece of property. You have to drag your hose. If you are 88 years old and not in really good health, but you're on a limited Social Security and a very limited pension, you're not going to drag your hose all the way over there. And the truth of the matter is that we've been fortunate that we've always been able to meet what people have requested, and sometimes not even filled all of those plots, usually just one or two might be empty. So out the door gardening allows people with those kinds of issues to grow food very conveniently and safely. Safety is an issue too, because when you are gardening, many of us enjoy hitting that alarm at about 5:30 in the morning during the summer and getting out to your garden at 6 o'clock. That it's tough to say this, but that's not safe anymore in South Burlington. To be in the center there where nobody would hear you if you were disrupted by somebody passing through that might have ill feelings, it's just not safe. The same is on the North Sunset side. You just really wouldn't want to be there if there's nobody else out there. Some people are okay with it. I personally just have a greater awareness of that. So I think I covered a certain
Yeah,
topic.
Representative O'Brien has
Just
a
a
question.
Quick, to give us some context, how many residents at Stonehenge North?
77. So 18,
18 spots, right?
but only 18 spots. So then the next group that I really, really want to attend to is Stonehenge used to be, and I just am going to throw it in this way so that we all are really aware, even of what these folks were talking about, how the development of Vermont is changing. So Stonehenge North used to be a place where you invested in your very first property. You were young, you were single, or you were a young couple, and this was how you were going to build your credit towards owning a home. And the minute, if you were a couple, you had a child, by the time that child was walking, you were looking at buying, a smaller ranch or something like that so your family could expand. The economy's changed and people are staying there. And people also stay there because, okay, they really love South Burlington schools. But primarily the economy has changed. So if you're a young couple and you are living paycheck to paycheck, which is happening in Stonehenge today, and you have children under the age of 5, you know that as a couple, all of your energy every single day is focused on how you manage getting out the door to your own jobs on time so your bosses are satisfied and you get your children comfortably settled into their childcare. And then on the reverse side of coming home, you've coordinated with your partner how you get home, pick up your child, do dinner, baths, homework, whatever's happening, and get them into bed. Somewhere in there, if you are really struggling and you want to grow food, there's a huge difference between a garden out your door and trying to get one of you or everyone down to the center of the property. So it becomes prohibitive.
That Lipsky.
Is shared. When you first were presenting, you talked about bylaws.
Mhm.
Now, were they municipal bylaws or covenants of the HOA? that you were-
They're covenants of the HOA. So that was, well, I want to be careful. This is a very big issue for me. And I love
the
it.
Second
But I've learned a lot.
with Martin, you kept referring to.
Martin Lamont.
Lamont.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So I approached him. I want to tell you, I feel like a kid in a candy store. I'm a retired elementary school teacher, and I always had 4th grade in one configuration or another. So you spend your half of your year almost teaching about Vermont, but I'm really passionate about civics. So I feel like I'm living my dream today. I'm living everything I ever taught my kids. Like, you do it. And Vermont is, in my opinion, the best place in the world to do it, because I can call Martin and call him Martin. And Martin can sit and formulate an idea, and then bang, I'm really here with how you move it forward. It's lucky.
We value civics.
Well, I do too.
Representative Nelson.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Chair, you rebel.
What?
You are a rebel.
Yes, South Florida code used to be rebels.
Yeah, there you go. You know, to think that people want to be able to grow food so they can eat. Are you allowed to grow in raised beds or in tubs or whatnot outside your door?
No,
And would that? I'm on clay.
Mhm.
I live in Derby and I got clay. I mean, great location, terrible soil, but we grow everything in raised beds. Um,
And we're on sand because we're in the Lake Champlain Valley. And so,
well, you're not on clay, which a lot of it is, but you're on good soils there.
so part of what I proposed to Martin was being sure that the language include the ability to plan. Basically, if I'm thinking intensive gardening, I'm thinking square foot gardens. So in the ground, square foot gardens, raised beds.
Mhm.
The other one that's really important is elevated beds. So anybody that's using a walker or a wheelchair is able to grow their own food. And the last one is container gardening. And there's no reason in today's world not to be able to do that with curbside value in mind. And there is a person in Stonehenge South, and this is how I found out, they're differently structured or strict than Stonehenge North. They've been told flat out, he has the most gorgeous container gardens that are flower gardens right in front of his home. Not one of those containers is being used for food because they cannot grow food. Period.
Flowers are okay,
Pardon? But flowers are okay,
but not food.
but not food. So,
Let your lettuce grow long enough and they'll head out. Then it's
Yes.
flower.
but that's what's exciting to me about being in Vermont, because again, our resource base for really understanding the difference between, okay, if you're going to grow it out front and you're going to meet everybody's needs collaboratively and build a consensus, you can have bush cherry tomatoes so that when you're driving around the development, you're really just looking at a bush with orange spots. Or you can have vining cherry tomatoes, which other people that don't even live in your little cluster or whatever will not be able to swallow because they don't have that, whatever it is, spirit of food gardens looking as beautiful as perennials.
Do the homes in your neighborhood have a back door? Is there a backyard, or do they have units that back against one another?
So we're buildings of 4 units in most cases. We have a few buildings of 3 units. As far as I know, all the water is in the front. So, but that doesn't mean that all the units are Stonehenge Drive facing. So that's some of it, some of what would happen in any development. Yes, there are back doors. But again, if you're thinking, how are you getting water there?
Mhm.
I would like the language to reflect within reasonable distance of your outdoor spigot. Otherwise, you're back to the same problem as what happens in the center gardens, where somebody might be dragging a hose around the side of the property, which then can open you to legalities if somebody falls and trips over your hose. Or say you get a leak, you spring a leak and it seeps into their downstairs.
And it sounded like, despite your collective goodwill and best intentions, having a change to the covenant or whatever it is that the governing documents was too big a hurdle for you to cross. And can you just say anything about that? Are you familiar with, are you on the board or?
So, yeah, so in all transparency, so this little rebel started the Land Stewardship Committee, whose sole purpose is to try to move Stonehenge from a financially managed property to a land stewardship managed property. And so we're looking at how would you bring this very monoculture environment back into biodiversity as an urban setting. That's a mouthful, but really fun.
We understand that.
Yes, I know. I'm so excited to be here with this group because now I'm going to be energized to go out and stay the course. And then because that was so important to me, I did run for board and was elected based on several principles, that being one of the big ones. that I'm trying to help guide our community towards. And right now, currently, we have been fortunate enough to acquire the help of Fortino Acosta, who's an award-winning landscape designer and lecturer at UVM. And he has 8 students this spring who are finishing a project in Morrisville, who will then come to Stonehenge North and develop a vision for what that urban biodiversity renewal could look like over 5 or 7 years of investment.
Senator Boswell, you had a,
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I have to leave for an appointment.
Mhm.
But I don't think we're at a point where we're gonna be voting on this today, but we've talked about this prior to your coming to give testimony, and I think I can't speak for my committee mates, but I think in general, the spirit of our committee is that we absolutely support this. And I totally think that this policy makes sense, whether or not it is possible to change the policy in your particular housing development. It sounds like housing developments have the authority to make these restrictions. That must be true in many other places around our state. And it feels like we would be doing a great service to the people of Vermont to be able to say, just like in whatever it was, 2009, yes, you
Right,
can
you
hang
can.
your laundry on your patio. You also can grow a garden in your yard. And I totally believe that should be a basic common sense human right. And I hope we can get there for you this term.
Well, I
Municipal regulation.
thank you, Michelle.
I think if I really, my learning curve has been like this, and you all probably know it much more thoroughly than I do. The place where we intersect is at the Common Interest Ownership Act. And that is from the legislature. And that is where that's the foundational law that developers use to develop the declarations and bylaws that they have to have in place in order to sell properties. The challenge with that is the developer is creating those, from my perspective, the developer is creating those based on an entirely different perspective. How am I marketing and selling these units and making people feel good about the fact that the land is owned commonly? Where the homeowner perspective is, where is my agency over the land that I'm paying taxes on? And it's interesting. I mean, when I was 40-ish, or I was 40, my 40s, early 40s, when I bought my property, what I wanted from that property is entirely different than what I want from it. I just turned 70 in October. And so my own development plays into the passion of really trying to create some kind of bill out of the legislature that protects those kinds of changes and somehow reins in the developers. Once the developers have the declaration and the bylaw and the rules are easier to change depending on how people are feeling. And you all know that people are on boards for different reasons and find different energy for how they carry themselves on a board. To try to create a super majority, which is 80%, according to my research, and I know from taking a stand in my own neighborhood, is difficult because human behavior is challenging.
80%,
80%
of the board members to vote?
80% of
Committee.
the homeowners would have to vote to say that out the door gardens, a new use for the common element called out the door gardens is palpable.
So I can understand why that might seem insurmountable, and coming back to the, as you said, sort of the founding document, the section of statute that controls these common interest ownership would be the easier approach, despite, as we know, how challenging it is to change any law. I think let's get one more question, and then we should probably thank you for coming and move on, because I know others are hoping to testify to. Representative O'Brien.
Yeah, just quickly, could you share with this committee the language that prohibits, the growing of food? Because I can imagine as a rebel, you must be like, I'm gonna grow nasturtiums. It's a flower, but I'm gonna eat, just in violation of the HI, I'm gonna eat the blossoms. And it seems like it's so absurd that I'd love to see the language that says you can grow flowers, but you can't grow food.
Yeah, we don't have that, and particularly that language explicit that way in Stonehenge North. And there are little, well, I'll call them flicks in the rules, which are separate from the bylaws of the declaration that appeared on the surface to make this reasonable. But when you are trying to build a consensus in a community, you don't need very many people to unravel other people's efforts, because you're talking about a volunteer board that doesn't have any legal or just any legal background for being able to understand where the boundaries between the Vermont, I always get it wrong, the Vermont Interest Ownership Act, the declaration, and the bylaws, where those boundaries are and the rules. And so it's not always that cooler heads prevail. And sometimes because that 80%, it takes so much effort to get a little tiny inconsequential change comfortable for everyone. You have a lot of people who don't live there year round. We have a lot of people who are not tech savvy and everything's going onto the computer. It's just a lot. So there's only one thing, and I thought a lot about saying this. I think I might be in love with you, calling me a rebel. I thought a lot about saying this. I'm really hoping that this is a win-win, I believe, for Vermont. I also believe it's a win-win for Governor Scott to sign it into action, because what more? I mean, our character, our historic character, is about self-sufficiency and resiliency and independence, and then community-minded action, right? And as this representative was saying, Michelle was saying, there's nothing more basic than food. And people are panicking. They're watching their inability to put the food that they would want or are used to or feel are healthy on their table. So I'm imploring you, and I know you're busy, but I'm going to do it anyway, to see whether or not you could get this bill to align with the 2026 growing season. And I'm going to say why, and I've thought a lot about this. So please note my smile and my sense of humor and stick with me. I think that we're headed for food challenges in the United States this summer. We're deporting our agricultural workforce. And we can't even barely begin to think about who's going to be working our dairy farms and picking our apples. I believe, because of Vermont's history of resiliency and independence, we have the capacity to act, to make sure that from this legislative body, there is a proactive, common sense response to people's ability to grow food. Very quietly during COVID, there were little messages that came out from the state about encouraging people to grow gardens. It wasn't changing anything legally, but it was there, and it was just the quietest little hum. It wasn't like it was put out on the table for everybody to look at. But I do really enjoy my neighbors. I am hearing stories. I am 70. My budget, I planned for this time in my life. And I am shocked that I've gone from being able to buy a week's worth of food. I'm very committed to certain organic foods so that I maintain a healthy lifestyle. I've gone from $100, $120 a week for the food that I need for a week to $350 in the last 2 months. I cannot get out of the store sometimes for less than $80 if I've bought some chicken and maybe hamburger, if that's part of my grocery list for that day. So I'm imploring you, because I don't want that to be the issue, that what's going on nationally to be the issue for this, because that's not how it started for me. But I do believe that many, many people are like deer in the headlights. And what they're not, in order to just stay balanced with the amount of change and the energy of crisis in the area, in the air, they're not connecting the dots about what is going to come when we have to start tilling soil in this country. And I think we can do something to have calm and that spirit of Vermont, she's got her feet on the ground. Okay, so that's it.
Good, thank you, Chair. And I have no doubt that you will take your this rebel energy and not leave it here in this room, but expand it to other rooms in the building. Thank you for coming in.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, my radishes and lettuce will be planted in April, even up in Derby, if I have to shovel my raised bed.
See, so people are already sitting with their catalogs and ordering their seed. All right, so I'm gonna take back the rebel thing and just say, I'm a good Vermonter, carrying the tradition of what it means to be a really good Vermonter. All right?
Thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you very much. And is someone going to let me know what the next steps are as you look at this?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm happy to come by anytime and revel in this amazing experience, being part of this. Oh,
All right, Oliver, I see you on the screen and you can hear us all right?
Yes, I can hear you, Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear. And Billy Coster is joining us in person. And I don't know whether either of you wants to have screen sharing as we set that up.
I think Oliver was gonna more or less run it, if that's okay with you, Oliver.
Yeah, that sounds good. I will, in a minute here, request permission to share my screen to walk through the some statutory language edits. Hopefully I have that privilege already, or that can be given. I see a green share button, so maybe I'm good to go.
It'd be good to go, yeah. And then while you're doing that, I'll just point out to the committee that this, what's going to appear on the screen is also on our committee page. So we're hearing now from Agency of Natural Resources on the proposed language that the Land Use Review Board shared with us last week, implementing some of the recommendations from the Wood Products Manufacturers Report. And you'll remember that the board came in, had draft language on recommendations 1, 9, and 10. They had already done number 1, that was preparing a fact sheet. So we were left with 9 and 10. And so I don't think that ANR is addressing number 1 here at all. I think it's mostly 9 and 10. With that, Bill, if you want to.
Sure. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Billy Coster. I'm the Director of Planning and Policy for the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. I'm here to support Oliver today as a subject matter expert in Act 250. One of my roles in the agency is to manage the agency's Office of Planning that represents ANR and our 3 departments in proceedings before Act 250 district commissions, as well as the Public Utility Commission. So when Act 250 applications are filed, we have a statutory obligation to provide district commissions evidence and recommendations as to whether those projects meet the environmental criteria. So we work with Forest and Parks, Fish and Wildlife, and others to do that work. So while FPR is leading the policy conversation here, I'm here to help answer questions about how this stuff might work in practice.
Great, and my name's Oliver Pearson. I'm the Director for Forest within the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. I'm actually on leave today up in the Northeast Kingdom, but doing my best to stay current on this. So yeah, I'll I'll begin with some background and then get into some of the specific points we want to make. So I think, Chair, as you just alluded, on January 16th, the Land Use Review Board published a memo on their website containing wood products manufacturers report statutory language recommendations. This memo was also provided to this committee on February 5th. It was provided to our department as well and the Agency of Natural Resource. And this memo builds on recommendations in the Act 181 Wood Products Manufacturers Report submitted to the legislature in June of 2025. And I'll start by saying that ANR appreciates the Land Use Review Board's efforts towards strengthening statute by aligning language pertaining to forestry with that pertaining to agriculture and facilitating appropriate review for development without imposing undue burden on logging and forestry. So just going back a little bit, ANR and specifically the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation was charged in Act 181 to consult with the Land Use Review Board on this report. The Land Use Review Board was in the lead, and this report was developed based on significant effort from the Land Use Review Board and FPR staff during the course of 2025. Significant public consultations, stakeholder committee meetings, permit analysis, and structured interview with permit holders and applicants. It represented a real significant body of work, and I'm pleased that this committee is interested in pursuing some other recommendations from this report. As mentioned, key recommendations number 9 and number 10 from the report involved a number of statutory reform ideas, really aimed at achieving the legislative mandate in Act 181 of addressing the Act 250 permitting process to better support wood products manufacturers in their role in the forest economy. And as you all recall, FPR visited with you on January 22nd to discuss FPR's perspectives on the legislative reform recommendations in the report. That was prior to the memo being released. And I'll briefly just remind you that ANR's key reform priorities were around sort of better aligning the Act 250 permit requirements related to forestry and logging with existing language that exists now for the Agriculture Center and specifically agricultural exemptions from Act 250 permit jurisdiction. And during that testimony in regards to recommendation 9 in the report, which was to extend benefits to logging and forestry that are similar to those conferred to farming. We shared with you that this is a key recommendation that both the Land Use Review Board and FPR support. It's in the report, and we feel any action related to this recommendation must also address Act 250 permit amendment jurisdiction and permit conditions that in some cases impede forestry operations and/or conflict with department approved forest management plans. And we provided some examples of that in our testimony back in January. And then sort of the other key recommendation 10, was reinstating the exemption for log and pulp concentration yards. And it's great to see that they proposed statutory change that draws from the report language in recommendation 10 is moving forward in the memo that the Land Use Review Board put forward. And we view that this is a simple process of sort of reinstating an exemption for log and pulp concentration yards as it existed prior to 2022. And then before we get into our specific recommendations, I'll just briefly mention that our third priority recommendation that FPR presented to this committee back in January was that the Stony Brook determination process should be triggered automatically rather than simply offered as a potential path to an applicant. The memo with statutory reform language proposed by the Land Use Review Board is silent on this issue, but I am pleased that the Land Use Review Board will make the availability of the Stony Brook determination process known to wood products manufacturers applicants via the new fact sheet and supplemental guidance that are mentioned in recommendation 1 that Chair Durfee already mentioned. So with that brief introduction, I'll get into our specific recommended edits to the statutory reform language that the Land Use Review Board has put forth. We feel that these edits are consistent with previous FPR formal comments on the Wood Products Manufacturers Report and consistent with the stated goal for this whole effort in Act 181. And so at this point, I'll share my screen and just sort of walk the committee through these edits. I would just also let the committee know that I do have a hard stop at 4 p.m. So hopefully we can conclude any necessary business on this during that time. Chair, I think you mentioned that this memo has been submitted to the committee. And so what I'll briefly do is walk through the different statutory reform recommendations the Land Use Review Board put forth, and then highlight some suggested edits or changes to that language that ANR is suggesting. And so, the first one was a change to 10 VSA 6001 subsection 3, which is a definitions section. And I think you've already seen the memo, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on what of the blurb Land Use Review Board put forward in their memo. I'll just move to our suggested edits, which are in red ink. And hopefully, Chair, this approach is working for you. If the screen is too small to read or anything in the room, please let me know. But what essentially what ANR wanted to do is just provide some edits to the language in this recommendation recommended text as follows. One, as you'll hear from me next, we didn't feel that the terms logging and forestry merit new definitions, hence the recommended edit to strike the text here at the top of the page as defined in subsection. And then we felt that it was important to be clear that the portions of the parcel or tract that support the development or mitigation areas necessary for the development to comply with another chapter related to Act 250 shall be subject to regulation under this chapter. And it was in conversations with our colleagues in the Fish and Wildlife Department who reminded us that there are some Act 250 permits, are arguably 100-acre plot where development is occurring on 10 acres of that plot. Then to mitigate or offset that development, there's some permit conditions that could pertain to how forests are managed for the remaining balance of in this example, 90 acres. And so specifically citing that those mitigation areas should be jurisdictional is the goal of that added language there. Continuing through this paragraph to the next sentence, it starts with permits issued. We added some similar text there. Permits issued under this chapter shall not impose conditions on other portions of the parcel or tract of land that do not support the development or necessary mitigation areas, and that restrict or conflict with logging or forestry activities, including the implementation of the AMPs or the acceptable management practices that protect water quality jobs in Vermont, water quality and logging jobs in Vermont, excuse me. And I can answer questions in a second about why we added that sentence there, but it's essentially ensuring that there's no permit conditions that prevent the implementation of the AMPs, which are a very important part of protecting water quality on logging jobs in Vermont, as mentioned. And then finally, we added some text at the end of this clause that essentially says that any portion of the parcel that's not being used to produce. Any portion of parcel that's being used to produce wood products for a wood products manufacturer located elsewhere on the tract shall not constitute land that supports this development unless it is also used for some other purpose that supports the development, including necessary mitigation areas. So the point of this is to limit the Act 250 jurisdiction to portions of the parcel, it's a tongue twister, that are essentially, necessary to meet sort of the legislative intent of Act 250 and therefore limit the jurisdiction there. So this is sort of the one of the various edits we're proposing. This is probably the most substantive. So, Chair, I can either stop there and take questions, or we can continue.
Yeah, let's just pause for questions. Is the last sentence in red here that's underlined that you've added in this paragraph that specifically say wood products manufacturers? Is this sort of a belts and suspenders sentence, or is it necessary because this is not covered elsewhere?
Do you want me to speak there, Oliver? Or?
Sure, go ahead.
So there's a similar clause in the ag exemption already in Act 250. And correct me if I'm wrong, Oliver, but this is intended to be clear that if there's a jurisdictional development on a property that uses wood products as a raw material, and you're harvesting that wood from that parcel, the harvesting of that wood is not jurisdictional to Act 250. So it lets you own a large parcel, operate a mill or some sort of facility that has an Act 250 permit, but you're not encumbered elsewhere if you're feeding wood into that development.
Okay, good, thank you. I brought this up earlier in maybe in committee and definitely offline and talking with Pledge Council, and I just want to mention it here, that if you scroll up, Oliver, to the very bottom of the first page, where this sentence begins, so this is the proposed new language: when development is proposed to occur on a tract of land that's devoted to logging and forestry activity, and noting that this is language that exists, it's parallel to the language that exists in the previous section for agriculture, and it's the devoted to, that expression that I just wanted to double check on. And be sure that there isn't, and we talked about this with the board too. And you know, the board is proposing a language, the board is pointing out the same language that exists for ag, and we understand what it means. Everybody's clear on it. But since it's not the way we would normally talk in regular discourse, at some point, want to be sure a court doesn't come in and say, well, actually, no, we're interpreting things differently. We know that courts sometimes do that. If, for example, and we used this example the other day, you have 100 acres, 90 acres are not forested for one reason or another, and 10 acres are, and you're interested in logging those 10 acres. Is it clear that that parcel is devoted to logging and forestry? Because if it's not, then none of the rest of this applies, it seems to me. So that's, I realize that you've gone on then and you're addressing, we're only talking about, you know, the mitigation areas, or we're supporting development areas. But I just want to be sure that we're not, like, right off the bat excluding a parcel like the one I just described. And if you have any thoughts or reactions to that, but again, the board's reaction is, yeah, we think it's okay to leave this as is. So if I'm the only one objecting at this point, then that's fine too. But I just want to ask our witnesses if they have any reaction to that.
I think, if I can speak for Oliver, I think this was a concern that Forest Parks and Recreation did raise for the same reasons you're articulating. I think we felt that since this was the LURB's proposal, that there's been this longstanding exemption for agriculture that seems to have worked, that uses this language, that we were comfortable with their recommendation. But certainly if this is something that the committee feels like could be refined further, we'd be open to that conversation. I think as we go further down, there is another provision that explicitly says forestry and logging below 2,500 feet is exempt from Act 250. So that is kind of the belt and suspenders for this one.
Representative Burke.
So if we did, I'm wondering what it's like normally when we're not talking about parcel tract of land that is devoted to logging or forestry or agriculture. So if it's just said when development is proposed to occur on a parcel of tract of land, only those, if we were to cut out the part about logging, only those portions of the parcel of tract of land that support the development or mitigation areas necessary for the development shall be subject to the regulation. What is normally the case if we're not doing forestry or agriculture? What is it? The whole tract is automatically under Act 250?
The whole tract is jurisdictional unless the landowner or applicant goes through what's referred to as the Stony Brook analysis, which allows you to limit jurisdiction to just the portion that directly supports the jurisdictional development. And that is an option for any forest landowner to go through. They're going through Act 250. So that would narrow jurisdiction altogether. I think what's suggested here is that the whole parcel could stay in under Act 250 jurisdiction, but the only time that restrictions could only apply to activities that support the development, not things that happen outside of it. And that's the way the law is intended to work. I think this is like just trying to be overly explicit for things like agriculture and forestry, that you can't limit those activities even though you're regulating some other activity on the same property.
So know what you're saying, that normally, regardless of whether agriculture or forestry is taking place on the property, that normally when there is a proposed development on land that only the area that the development is taking place in will fall under Act 250?
It'll-
And plus the mitigation areas.
The whole property would be in Act 250 jurisdiction. But in theory, the Act 250 permit for that development should only apply to the development itself or kind of any mitigation area necessary. It's this concept of nexus that you can't like unduly put restrictions on someone's property that aren't necessary to comply with the criteria or offset the impacts of the development. Candidly, over, it happens sometimes that Act 250 permits are more pervasive, that maybe a neighbor asks for and a landowner agrees to restrictions that are broader than what is at the very minimum necessary to meet those criteria. So I think this is trying to be really explicit that in situations where agriculture and forestry are taking place, that practice is not appropriate.
Good, thank you, and thank you for answering or reacting to my question. I'm honestly inclined to just leave it if we've got agreement between the two different folks who are weighing in here of two different perspectives. I'm not gonna complicate things further, I think, but Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, Billy, I think the chairman's example sort of flipped the script. For the last few weeks, we've used the term 90 of those 100 acres will remain in active management, forestry, and 10 acres are being removed for developmental purposes. In the last example was 90 acres will be come under jurisdiction of Act 250, but not the 10 acres that are actually forest. With that intent.
Yeah. And it actually was a concern that we'd heard from stakeholders.
Again, I think it's a valid concern, and that language devoted to seems pretty archaic. So I think if you all are, and I know Oliver agrees, if you all are interested in exploring that further, we're certainly open to it. I think we didn't have a great solution necessarily in mind, given that the LURB felt like this was appropriate. So we could work with them a little bit more to see if we can come up with something that's mutually agreeable.
All right, well, why don't we move on? Take a moment.
Great, yeah, thanks, Chair. So the next set of reforms that the Land Use Review Board put forward were to add definitions for logging and forestry in section 10 VSA 6001 of statute. I know you've had some discussions about this, so I'll move on to sort of our reaction to that. We don't really support the creation of new definitions for logging and forestry in 10 VSA 6001. There is a definition that already exists in both Title 10 and Title 12 for forestry operations. Logging and forestry today are not defined terms in statute in Vermont. And the LURB proposed definitions are somewhat inconsistent with the existing statutory definition for forestry operations, and risk either being limiting or causing confusion as we try to govern this sector. And I know we try to stay as consistent as possible with the report, the Act 181 Wood Products Manufacturers Report, and the report itself did not propose introducing definitions for these two terms, and therefore we didn't vet those ideas with stakeholders. In the same manner that the other 10 recommendations that do form the basis for the report were vetted. So I have some more specific concerns about these two definitions, which are up on the screen here and in the document that we shared with you. I can go through them, Chair Durfee, but I think that the key point is, these definitions really, I think at the end of the day, we don't feel that introducing new definitions for these terms that define an activity that is within FPR's jurisdiction, existing jurisdiction to regulate, encourage, and promote, et cetera, under Title 10 is really, is advisable at this point, and as I said, could create some confusion. And we do think it'd be fine to refer, if that needed within the Act 250 context, to the existing definition of forestry operations that's in 10 VSA 5401. That would provide consistency and avoid any unintended consequences. And then certain aspects of the the definition around logging, we're sort of, there's some specific concerns about those. But I'll stop there unless anyone has any follow-up questions they want to ask on this point.
Representative Burke.
Yeah, Oliver, one of the things that I think was, I saw when it was included in the definition of logging, having the log and pulp concentration yards in there. One of the ideas was to make sure that they weren't gonna come under Act 250. Is there? It looks like the language that we have proposed here isn't really addressing those.
Well, I mean,
Log yards.
if I scroll down to the next point, we're specifically actually trying to remove log and pulp concentration yards from the definition of wood products manufacturer. That was one of the key recommendations we made when we visited you in January. Prior to 2022, the definition of wood products manufacturer did not include log and pulp concentration yards. That was added in 2022, and we think that was an oversight. And a clear recommendation from the report was to remove log and pulp concentration yards from that definition. So Representative Bird, I think hopefully that answers your question about sort of our intent here, by removing, I'll just scroll down again, by removing log and pulp concentration yards, which you can see here in the text that's in strike through from the definition of wood products manufacturer, that sort of, reduces or removes some of the Act 250 jurisdiction, over those sites. Does that answer your question, Representative?
Yeah, that does. Yes. Thank you.
So the definition there, when it was created, so it was created in legislation 4 or 5 years ago, and it inadvertently, I think we can say, included log and pulp concentration. And it wasn't as though it was like it didn't previously say anywhere in statute that logging or forestry did include log concentration yards. It was, I think, statute was silent on that. So this, I think, just striking the language gets us where we need to be. I would think. So, Representative Lipsky.
Thank you. I concur. I very much support the language under logging. My question, it came up in a discussion, you used the word fertilization. And it just came up in committee discussion. And I was thinking perhaps liming, if you were seeding and mulching adjacent to stream crossing and you needed to amend the soil. When else would fertilization be used in a forestry operation?
Yeah, I think under the AMPs, as you point out, Representative Lipsky, that's part of closeout. And it's an option to loggers when they're, as you said, seeding and mulching, sometimes a steep slope, often associated with a stream crossing, permanent or temporary stream crossing. And the fertilizer can be used to help regrow vegetation to stabilize those soils. So that's sort of the key element of it. As you know, Representative Lipsky, fertilization is not something that's used as part of either natural or even selective directed regeneration efforts.
All right, thank you. That makes it clear. Thank you.
All right, so in any case, the agency's position is we don't need to include new definitions here for logging and forestry. We're okay with continuing with essentially the status quo without adding these definitions.
Correct.
Or to refer to, correct me if I'm wrong, Oliver, there is an existing definition elsewhere in statute that for forestry that could be referred to.
Yeah.
All right.
Bill,
I know your time's limited, Oliver, so if you want to press on to the last section.
Sure. Yeah, and I think Billy, I agree with what you just said. So finally, this third section out of 4 is just saying we agree with the Land Use Review Board's proposal to strike log and pulp concentration yards from the definition of wood products manufacturer. That was part of the report's recommendation. So in the last section, the Land Use Review Board was proposing to amend 10 VSA 6081 regarding sort of jurisdiction for permit amendments over logging and forestry below the elevation of 2,500 feet. And so what we did here was we really tried to make the language proposed. We support the concept, but we tried to make the language proposed to really mirror that's used to govern permit conditions in the agriculture sector. And so it's to point one here, it's a slight change to say no permit or permanent amendment is required for logging and forestry below the elevation of 2,500 feet that will not conflict with any permit condition issued pursuant to this chapter. And that mirrors exactly the language for agriculture. And sort of the way that the Land Use Review Board had worded it was a little more expansive, and we felt more comfortable with it being sort of narrow to the existing language used in agriculture. And then number two was basically saying permits shall include a statement that logging and forestry activities consistent with this subsection and below the elevation of 2,500 feet are exempt from amendment jurisdiction under this subsection. Billy alluded to that earlier. This is really that key reinforcement of the concept that as long as logging and forestry are consistent with the other text of this subsection below 2,500 feet, they're exempt from amendment jurisdiction under this subsection. And so that means that there's, as we said earlier, it's still possible that there might need to be some mitigation regarding a development that impacts logging and forestry, but logging and forestry itself, as long as they're consistent with the subsection and below the elevation, remain exempt. So I'll stop there, Chair. And Billy, you might want to come in if you want to add any clarification to our edits on this last section.
Yeah, I think you covered it, Oliver. Really, the intent here is that logging and forestry is allowed unless it runs afoul of a specific existing Act 250 condition on the property. But beyond that, it should be allowed and without any Act 250 oversight.
So the language that you've struck there, proposed striking, Oliver, at the very bottom, violate any finding, conclusion, term, or condition. So the word condition is the one that's consistent. What is the concern that including finding a conclusion or term in this language might cause? And recognizing that it's not parallel to what's existing with agriculture, but setting that aside, what is the concern?
I think part of the concern, or go ahead. So the conditions are very specific and say, these are the restrictions that run with the land. They're very clear and intentional. These other references to findings, conclusions, terms, this goes deep into the Act 250 record. And there's some concern that there might be an inadvertent reference of how much land might be logged or cut for the property. There just may be some incongruity amongst those different portions of an Act 250 application for some future use for logging. So we just didn't want to see a situation where someone opposed to logging or forestry on a property dug through a 20-year-old Act 250 application and said, oh, you didn't affirmatively say you're going to cut trees on your back 40, so therefore it violates the terms of that application. And since agriculture doesn't include that long list of potential sources, we thought it would be appropriate to take it out. The conditions are really what are controlling, so we thought leaving that in was most critical.
Right. I'm going to say thank you and just look around the table one more time and see if anybody else has any thoughts. I know you've submitted this to the board. Thank you for their reaction. And I believe the board may be meeting in the next couple of days and hopefully will take a look and hopefully let us know if they have any reaction in turn. And we will have some further conversation about this tomorrow morning. Thank you for coming in. Thank you.
Yep. Great.
Thanks, Oliver.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and we look forward to discussing this with the board and as needed and with you as needed in the future. So we'll sign off. Thanks again.
So I'm going to have us just take a 30-second break here. I want to be sure that we have the letter posted.
Yep.
We do. Okay. So let's just take a 30-second break.